Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon, in the waning hours of Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. So Chodesh Tov. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Missouri. Paula says it's hot. It is hot. Very hot here too. Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehudit in South Carolina. Yesterday, my friend died. I'm so sorry, Brooke Dynamis. After a short illness in the hospital, and I am blessed that I was able to be at Sarah Chaya's bedside. Today, Hashem granted me an even bigger mitzvah, to be able to purify her body as a member of the Hever Kadisha before her burial. Yasher Koach, Yehudis, what an important mitzvah. That you were able to participate. May your friend's memory always be for a blessing, and may her neshama, her soul, have a great elevation in the world of souls. We say Amen. Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Belle in Texas, Leona in Illinois. Exactly as Sharon says, the greatest mitzvah is the one that can never be repaid. That's why it's called the mitzvah shel emes, the true mitzvah, when we attend to the needs of the dead. Also Melissa in Great Neck. And on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia. Ella, shalom from Southern California. Great to know where you're located. Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page Yud Beis, page 12 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 here in chapter 1. We pick this up right near the top of page 12a. That there is a similar distinction we were talking about, that a doorway, the entrance to a home into a courtyard, or the entrance of a courtyard into an alleyway, gets a certain amount of space allotted to that entranceway within the courtyard or the alleyway, because people need a space to unload animals, etc. And that's an entranceway even if the door is closed and locked, even if the door is sealed. But if the doorposts are broken, meaning they remove all vestiges of the doorway, and just make a complete smooth wall where the doorway was, okay, so then they don't get this 4 cubits in front of that former entranceway, because that entranceway has disappeared. Now, there's a similar distinction with regard to the laws of ritual impurity, as we're going to learn about entranceways, right? When is an entranceway, and when is it not? So similar to the space allotted within a courtyard or alleyway, since the laws of a corpse, a human corpse, transmitting impurity are also to some extent dependent on whether there's a proper entranceway to a home or not, we're going to find a similar law. So there's a halacha that a house in which there is a corpse transmits ritual impurity only through its doorways. And the Baraisa continues, a grave whose entrance is sealed does not render all of its surroundings ritually impure. The ritual impurity extends only to the area opposite the entrance. Meaning, even though the entrance is sealed, it functions as a doorway, as an entrance. With the idea being that if you have a house that has a corpse in it, so then if you're standing immediately outside the house, even within 4 cubits of the walls, you are not rendered impure with corpse impurity the way you might be if you're standing right next to a grave. Okay, now we know that if you're under a roof with a corpse, the tuma, the ritual impurity, is transmitted to you. If you're standing just outside the house, it is not transmitted to you because, so to speak, the ritual impurity. This does not have anything to do with disease and carrying disease and bubonic plague, nothing like that. Remember, always when we're talking about tuma, we're talking about ritual impurity, impurity that extends by dint of halacha, of Torah law, not some kind of pseudoscience related to germs. Okay, so what we're talking about is that if a corpse is inside some kind of a building, so if there's a doorway, even if that doorway is closed, then it's like the tuma, that ritual impurity has a path to exit. And so you're only going to become ritually impure if you walk inside or stand in that doorway. However, if a body is inside some kind of a building and the doorposts are broken, right, meaning that the walls are sealed completely as if there are no doorways, right, the doorways are removed and it's just solid walls around it, then that building becomes like a grave. And you will become tameh, ritually impure, just from standing next to that building within 4 cubits of the wall, because the building no longer has entrances and it's a kind of portal for that ritual impurity to find its way out. Right, so a grave whose entrance is sealed. Sealed means that it might be sealed, but there is a doorway, and this is as opposed to the doorways completely removed. But if one broke its doorposts, right, and removed the doorway, so it's just a solid wall, then those former doorways are not considered an entrance, and the grave renders all of its surroundings ritually impure, because impurity that has no egress bursts from all sides. And similarly, a house in which there is a corpse that has a sealed entrance does not render all its surroundings ritually impure. But if one broke the doorposts, right, just completely removed that entranceway, then it is no longer considered an entrance, and the corpse renders all of its surroundings, 4 cubits around the walls, ritually impure. I think that metaphorically, there's a really good lesson to be learned here, right? You kind of see this, I think Sun Tzu says something similar, right, in The Art of War. Like, you need an escape valve, right? The enemy needs an escape valve where he will retreat. But if you completely surround the enemy and there is no retreat, then the enemy will become much stronger in its desperation and burst out towards you. Right, so when we're fighting the spiritual battle against our own impulses, you kind of have to channel your wicked impulse into something. If you just try to suppress it as if it's not there, it will burst back at some point stronger. Now, Rabba Bar Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to alleyways that are open to another city, and through which one would ordinarily travel to reach the other city. So what we're talking about here is alleyways are distinct from the public domain, right? So the public domain is like public thoroughfares, public streets. Alleyways are jointly owned by the residents of the courtyards that open into those alleyways, right? So think of alleyways as private streets, and they might open up onto public streets. What they're talking about here is 2 cities that are kind of contiguous with each other. I mean, sort of like if you're in LA, when did you leave LA and enter Beverly Hills? Unless you saw an actual sign that told you, you really wouldn't know, right? I mean, the streets just continue from LA into Beverly Hills. The point here is that if there was an alleyway, which is to say a private street, that people were using to walk from LA to Beverly Hills, or from one contiguous city to another, the residents of that own that alleyway are not going to be able to shut down the alleyway, like give it only private access, if after they built it, they allowed the public to use that alleyway as a thoroughfare to go from one city to the other. Then it's like the public acquires an easement in that alleyway, and the residents can no longer shut off that alleyway, not allow people to walk through it. That's the concept. So where are we? So Rabba Bar Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says with regard to alleyways that open to another city, and through which one would ordinarily travel to reach that other city. If the residents of the city in which the alleyways are located wish to block them off, the residents of the other city into which the alleyways lead can prevent them from doing so because they have a right to reach their city via those routes, right? The public acquired this route. And the Gemara explains it is not necessary to state that they can prevent them from blocking the alleyways when there is no alternative route to reach their town, but they can prevent them even from blocking the alleyways when there is an alternative route. Right? So obviously, if there's no other route to get to the neighboring town, obviously they couldn't, shut off that alleyway as an access. But even where there is an alternative route, now that the public has become accustomed to using this alleyway, its residents can no longer close it off. Now, this is due to the reasoning of Rav Yehuda. And Rav Yehuda says that this is due to the reasoning that Rav Yehuda brings in the name of Rav. As Rav says, one is prohibited from ruining a path that the public has established as a public thoroughfare, i.e., steps may not be taken to prevent people from using it. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rav Giddel. As Rav Giddel says, if the public has chosen a route for itself and they walk on it, what they have chosen is chosen, and it cannot be taken away from them. Now, you might have had an opportunity when the first few people started using it to say, lest the public become accustomed to use this route, I'm going to put a fence around my property, and then they can go around. But you didn't do that, and the public, over time, became accustomed to, walking that path through your property. Now, you can no longer close it off. And Rav Anan says that Shmuel says, with regard to alleyways that open onto a public thoroughfare, if the residents of the alleyways wish to put up doors at the entrance of their alleyways, the people who use the public thoroughfare can prevent them from doing so, right? Same concept. And some sages understood from this that this statement applies specifically to the area within 4 cubits of the public thoroughfare, in accordance with the statement that Rabbi Zera says that Rav Nachman says. As Rabbi Zera says that Rav Nachman says, the 4 cubits in an alleyway that are adjacent to the public thoroughfare are considered like the public thoroughfare itself, and consequently this area has the law of a public thoroughfare. You might have thought that, but that is not so. There, the ruling of Rav Nachman was stated with regard to the issue of ritual impurity, with regard to which only the first 4 cubits of the alleyway are considered like the public thoroughfare. But here, with regard to doors set up at the entrance of the alleyway, sometimes the public thoroughfare becomes crowded with people and they enter far into the alleyway, even further than 4 cubits. Now, what's interesting here is they're not necessarily talking about an alleyway that the public uses to move from one street to a connecting street, right? A public thoroughfare here, there's a public thoroughfare over there that's parallel, and there's an alleyway, private alleyway linking them, and the public over time has become used to using that alleyway to walk from this street over to that street. Well, what if the alleyway doesn't lead to another public thoroughfare? What if it's a dead end? So it's an alleyway that's a dead end that opens into a public thoroughfare. Can the public, use that alleyway? Apparently, to some extent, yeah, because when streets are crowded, people end up, just kind of like stepping into the alleyway, maybe to take a rest, to let the crowd pass, to readjust the burden that they're carrying. And because this is, they've acquired that habit over time, now the residents of the alleyway can't stop them from doing it. Now, our Mishnah number 5, taught, and the court does not divide a jointly owned field. Right? We're talking about when one owner of a garden or a courtyard or a field, they're joint owners, and one of the joint owners wants to divide the field, right? Put up a wall, put up a barrier. You have your half, I have mine. We're not going to both use the whole field. We're going to divide it in half. And the Mishnah taught that if both want to divide it, fine, they divide it. But if only one of them wants to divide it, the court will not force the other one to have his field divided unless the resulting halves are of a minimum size. says. And that's what we're talking about here. And the court does not divide a jointly owned field unless there is space in it to plant 9 kav of seed for this one and 9 kav of seed for that one, right? So enough land to plant this many seeds and bring in a crop. So Rabbi Yehuda says the court does not divide a field unless there is space in it to plant 9 half kav of seed for this one and 9 half kav of seed for that one. So half of the previous minimum measure. And the Gemara comments, and they do not disagree with regard to the fundamental law, as this sage ruled in accordance with the custom of his locale, and that sage ruled in accordance with the custom of his locale. In one locale, the fields tended to be bigger, so they wouldn't divide it unless they could get this larger half measure. Then in a place where fields tend to be smaller, and people will accept a smaller measure as a usable half. The Gemara asks, the Mishna was taught in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. What practice should be followed in Bava, in Babylonia, which at this time was part of the Persian Empire? So Rav Yosef said, in Babylonia, a parcel of land the size of which is the area of a day's plowing. This is considered a field. If each of the parties will receive less than that, the field should not be divided, right? So instead of saying enough land that you could plant 9 kav of seed, they're saying the amount of land that a solo farmer can plow in one day, that amount of land is the minimum amount of land that you would call a field. So if when you split a field in two to divide it because they have joint owners, let's say 2 brothers inherit, now they're going to divide into 2 separate fields. If the resulting halves are smaller than the amount of land that one man can plow in a day, then it would no longer be called a field, and you can't make that division against the will of one of the co-owners. The Gemara asks, what is meant by a parcel of land the size of which is the area of a day's plowing? If it means a day's plowing in the planting season, i.e. the winter, when it is easy to plow because the ground is moist, since the earth has already been turned over at the end of the summer, when I guess you were harvesting, when you're preparing for this, so the field will not require 2 full days of plowing in the plowing season. Wait a minute. Let me read that again. What is meant by a parcel of land the size of which is the area of 1 day's plowing? If it means a day's plowing in the planting season, i.e. the winter, when it is easy to plow since the earth has already been turned over at the end of the summer, the field will not require 2 full days of plowing in the plowing season, i.e. at the end of the summer when it is more difficult to plow since the earth is hard and dry. So in that case, he will have to pay his summer plowman 2 days' wages for less than 2 days of work. And if it means a day's plowing in the plowing season, the field will not require a full day of plowing in the planting season. In that case, he will have to pay his winter plowman a full day's wages for less than a full day of work. Bottom line, when are you measuring this? When the earth is hard and dry, or when it is soft and moist and recently turned over? So the Gemara answers, if you wish, say it is referring to a day's plowing in the plowing season, and the field will still require a full day of plowing in the planting season, since he plows once before he sows the seeds, and then he repeats the plowing after the seeds are sown. And if you wish, say instead that it is referring to a day's plowing in the planting season, and the field will in fact require 2 full days of plowing in the plowing season if it is rocky ground, on which the plowing takes longer. In connection with this discussion, the Gemara clarifies the conditions under which a cistern, from which its joint owners draw their water, is divided. When do we divide a cistern co-owned by 2 people? So Rav Nachman said it should be divided only if each party will receive the volume of water needed for a day's irrigation work. As for an orchard, Shmuel's father says it should be divided only if each party will receive an area large enough to plant 3 kav, which is 1/3 of the measure required for a field. Right? Orchards can be very productive with less space than a field of grain. That opinion is also taught in a baraisa with regard to one who says to another, I am selling you part of a vineyard, without specifying how much of the vineyard he's selling. Sumakos says he may not give him less than an area large enough to plant 3 kav. He says, I'm selling you part of my vineyard. What did he say? totally ambiguous. Who would ever sell and who would ever buy based on a statement, I'm selling you part of my vineyard? What does that mean? So the sages here are applying a minimum measure. Okay, well, that means that the minimum that you are selling, if you say some, it must mean that you mean the minimum, and the minimum is the same area that we would divide a field, and if it was less than that, we wouldn't divide the field, right? So that's why Sumako says he may not give him less than an area large enough to plant 3 kav. Rabbi Yosei said, this is nonsense. And the way he expresses it is very colorful. He doesn't say this is nonsense. He says like this: these are nothing other than words of prophecy, i.e., I do not see the logic behind this statement. And it is as if based on prophecy and a heavenly decree, as the seller did not mention any area, but rather spoke in the most general of terms, part of a vineyard. And the Gemara asks, well, what is the measure with regard to this matter in Babylonia? And Rava Bar Kisna said 3 rows atziata of 12 vines, which is the area that a person can hoe in a single day. So now on this comment that Rabbi Yosei made, right, that you just spoke in such general terms that it is rendered legally meaningless. But he's keeping it positive, right? Instead of saying you just spoke nonsense, he says you're speaking like a prophet, right? Meaning we could have never come up with that logically. You must have received, your words from heaven, but we're not going to base a legal contract on this prophetic statement that you made, which we can't interpret without further prophecy, right? So that's why it's meaningless. Now, in connection with Rabbi Yosei's statement that Sumakos' words are nothing more than words of prophecy, the Gemara reports that Rabbi Abdimi from Haifa says, from the day that the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages. Right? Now think about that. Right? If you read, first of all, the Bible, what is the Hebrew Bible called? Tanakh. Right? So the ta is Torah. Nach, right? That means Nevi'im, prophets. And then the ach, right, is for ketuvim, the writings. So it's the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So the prophets, right, that was a period of Jewish history when we had prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Nehemiah, etc. And then eventually the period of prophecy ended. And that was sometime in the Second Temple period. In the late Second Temple period, the prophets had already ceased to be. But certainly by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, there were no more prophets. So did we cease to receive communication from heaven? No. But the manner of that communication changed, right? From God choosing somebody to be a prophet and receive God's word and then transmit that to the people. Instead, that God would now inspire our greatest Torah scholars to be able to understand, what God is saying to us through Scripture. And Scripture is just always alive and ever bursting, with truth and even with new understanding of old truths. Right, and so we understand almost a little bit metaphorically that prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages. Right, so it doesn't mean that the sages are having God speak to them directly the way God spoke to Moses or to Isaiah, but that they are receiving some kind of communication from heaven. Plus, we've also encountered how the sages would merit from time to time to hear a bas kol, right? The daughter of a voice. So not with the same kind of clarity as prophets received, but nevertheless, sometimes an audible communication from heaven. So now let's explore this idea a little more, that prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages. Now, the Gemara expresses astonishment. Is that to say that a sage is not fit to be a prophet? Are you saying that the prophets themselves were not sages? But Rav Avdimi seems to say that these are two distinct categories of people. And the Gemara explains, no, this is what Rav Avdimi is saying. Even though prophecy was taken from the prophets, it was not taken from the sages. That's very interesting. The logic here is not exactly how we would have spelled it out. And we have to really dig in and understand that. Now, what they're saying is, what do you mean the prophets are not sages? The prophets were sages, right? They weren't just guys who heard God's voice. The prophets were all people who are incredibly learned in Torah. In fact, we have a tradition elsewhere that there were many prophets, not just the prophets who ended up having books named after them in the Bible. There were many more prophets than that. And there were schools of prophecy. There were people who were aspiring to become prophets, and just some very few of them, sort of completed the journey. But it was in the sense that they had to be prepared to be prophets. They had to have memorized all of Scripture and all of the oral tradition and everything that could be known up until that time, right? And it was only on that fertile field that, prophecy might come. They had to satisfy these minimum requirements to be a prophet. And those minimum requirements were basically being a sage, right? So, but that kind of direct prophecy stopped coming after a while, but the kind of communication that came as a result of deep learning, that continued. A Maimar said, and a sage is greater than a prophet. Now we're saying that these are the same kinds of people, but the appellation sage actually is considered higher, a higher honor than prophet. Why? As it is stated, Psalm 90, verse 12. Now, Psalm 90 is the Psalm of Moses. Moses' Psalm, right? Where, teach us to number our years that we may acquire a heart of wisdom. That's from Psalm 90. Now, it also says here, in Psalm 90, verse 12, and a prophet has a heart of wisdom, i.e., he is wise. Now, when comparisons are drawn, who is compared to whom? You must say that the lesser is compared to the greater. That's Talmudic logic. So here too, prophecy is compared to wisdom. And this indicates that wisdom is greater than prophecy. It's a very interesting thing. Now, on the one hand, you would say, well, God chose the prophet. How can you say anybody or anything is greater than the one who was chosen by God? Yeah, well, but God also chose to stop sending prophets. And God continued to send sages and continued to send wisdom into the world that was gathered by our sages. So wisdom, the wisdom of the sages has outlasted prophecy, right? We still have sages. So what's going on? Right, one is compared to the other, right? Prophecy is compared to wisdom because wisdom is greater than prophecy. So Abaye said, and know that this is so, that the sages still enjoy the prophetic gift, right? It's not that wisdom is greater than prophecy because we don't need prophecy anymore. It's that wisdom is greater than prophecy because it includes prophecy, right? Maimar said, Abaye said, know that this is so, that the sages still enjoy the prophetic gift. As a great man makes a statement with regard to a point of halacha, of Jewish law, and the same statement is then cited in the name of a different great man in accordance with his statement, indicating that the sages make their statements by way of prophecy. In other words, when the sages independently arrive at the same conclusion, a conclusion that eluded previous generations, and then in the same generation, or nearly so, two sages independently arrive at this great and wonderful answer, it's because they've been blessed with a kind of prophecy. And Rava disagreed, and he said, and what is the difficulty with explaining this? Perhaps they were born under the same constellation, and since they are similar in their personal traits, they reach the same conclusions. So rather, Rava said, no, that this is so, as a great man makes a statement, and the same statement is then cited in the name of the well-known Tana, Rabbi Akiva Bar Yosef, in accordance with his statement. In other words, somebody arrives at a halakhic conclusion, and later it's found out that the greatest sage of them all, Rabbi Akiva, reached the same conclusion. This guy didn't know that Rabbi Akiva had reached that conclusion. He reached it independently. So how could he reach a conclusion that's the same as the greatest sage of all, Rabbi Akiva, reached? It must be that this person was granted some form of prophecy. And Rav Ashi said, what are you talking about? What is the difficulty of explaining that? Perhaps they were born under the same constellation. And with regard to this particular issue, the first sage does have the same understanding of Rabbi Akiva because he merited to learn in the same way, to have the same kind of personality, to have similar circumstances. And it's somewhat coincidental. Of course, he had to be very bright and very well learned and very well versed, and he worked all his life. But even though he's not as great as Akiva, he was able to learn something that Akiva, independently from Akiva, that Akiva also learned. Why is that so difficult to believe? So rather, Rav Ashi said, now we're on page 12b, know that this is so, that the sages enjoy some kind of prophecy, as a great man makes a statement, and the same statement is then cited as a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai, in accordance with his statement. In other words, some sage arrives at a halakhic conclusion that he didn't know was actually one of those oral laws given directly by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. He didn't know that, but he's able to derive it himself. It must be that he enjoyed some kind of prophecy. And the sage makes a statement that corresponds to words pronounced in heaven, which without prophecy is beyond human capability. And the Gemara challenges that and says, but perhaps he arrived at this idea by chance. He was just lucky. Without the assistance of prophecy, like a blind man who makes his way through a skylight. A blind man cannot deliberately find the skylight. Therefore, when he finds it, it's through luck. And the Gemara answers, but does the sage not offer a reason for his statement? The fact that he demonstrates an understanding of the issue indicates that he did not arrive at this idea by chance. Rather, he derived it, and he was able to derive it because he's enjoying some kind of prophecy. Rabbi Yochanan said, from the day that the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to imbeciles and children. And so now we see, okay, what's going on? The sages are starting to speak a little bit metaphorically, hyperbolically. This is some kind of important teaching that we need to grasp, right? We're not going to say that any imbecile walking down the street is actually a prophet, but, right, in keeping with what Shimon ben Zoma says, who is wise, one who learns from every person, don't dismiss anybody. Right? You may gather wisdom from any person that comes your way. Now, what does this mean? That prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to imbeciles and children. How could we prove that? The Gemara explains. In what way was prophecy given to imbeciles? It was like this incident involving Mar bar Rav Ashi, who was standing in the street of Mechoza, that's in Bava, when he heard a certain imbecile say, the head of the yeshiva who will be appointed in Mata Mechasya signs his name Tavyume. Now, Tavyume is an Aramaic version of Yom Tov, right? Yom Tov, good day, which means holiday, festival. A festival, a Jewish festival is called a Yom Tov. Yom Tov is also a name, right? There's a rabbi in Israel named Yom Tov Glazer. Yom Tov is a name. So, in other words, Mar bar Rav Ashi, right? The sage called Mar bar Rav Ashi. So that means he's the son of Rav Ashi. Is his name Mar? Mar is not a name. Mar is a title given to members of the family of the exilarch, the ruling family among the Jews in Bava. What was his actual name? Tavyume, right? The Aramaic form of Yom Tov. So, Mar bar Rav Ashi says to himself, who among the sages signs his name Tavyume? Nobody but me. I'm the only sage with this name. So conclude from the statement of the imbecile that my hour has arrived, and I will reap success in this matter. So he arose and went to Mata Mechazia. And by the time he arrived, the sages had already decided to appoint Rav Acha bar Difti as the head of that yeshiva, seemingly in contradiction to what he heard the imbecile say. But As soon as the sages heard that Mar Bar Rav Ashi had arrived in town, they determined not to proceed with their appointment without the approval of an important figure such as him. They didn't think that he should be appointed the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, but they said to themselves, well, this guy that we're going to appoint as the Rosh Yeshiva, we should run that idea past Mar Bar Rav Ashi before we finalize it. So they sent a pair of sages to consult with Mar Bar Rav Ashi at his inn, right, at his dwelling, his temporary dwelling here as he's visiting the city. So they sent 2 sages to talk with him, but they didn't come back. Why did they not come back? Because Mar Bar Rav Ashi detained them, kept them in conversation at his inn. So they sent again a pair of sages to him, and he detained them as well. Now he's got 4 guys he's chatting with. So they continued until they completed a quorum of 10 sages. They sent him a minyan of sages. Once they reached 10 men, Mar Bar Rav Ashi opened his lecture, taught, and expounded. Once they sent him 10 sages, the purpose of which was to consult with him about whether or not they appointed the right guy to be the Rosh Yeshiva, but once 10 of them were sitting in front of him, he began teaching them. Now, he wouldn't teach, a great sage like him, and during this period of the year, wouldn't teach to less than 10 people at a time. So once he's got 10 sages in front of him, he starts teaching. He did not speak earlier because one should not open a lecture during Kala, which are the gatherings for Torah study during the months of Elul and Adar, when less than 10 men are present. And once these 10 sages who had been sent to consult with him about whether or not they had appointed the right guy to be the head of the yeshiva in their town, once they heard Mar Bar Rav Ashi teaching in their town and realized just how brilliant he was, like they'd only heard of him. Now that they actually heard him teaching, they're like, oh my gosh, this guy's a genius. We should ask him if he will be the head of our yeshiva. And they asked him, and he said, yes, that's why I've come, right? Because he heard an imbecile in his own town say that he would be appointed the head of this yeshiva. That's why he came. Now they've invited him to do it, and he accepts the position. Understanding that he had been passed over, Rav Acha of Difti, the guy who the local sages had intended to appoint as the head of the yeshiva, this Rav Acha of Difti read about himself the rabbinic aphorism, anyone who is treated poorly will not soon be treated well, and anyone who is treated well will not soon be treated poorly. In other words, your fortunes change, but they don't change so fast. So Rav Acha understood that he had lost his chance to be appointed, whereas Mar Bar Rav Ashi had the good fortune to be appointed and would remain in this position. And that explains how prophecy was given to imbeciles. Now, an important teaching that we should take from that is, what really happened here, right? Did the imbecile receive prophecy and was, uttering words that the nation was intended to listen to? No. He said something, we don't know why he said it, from where he got that idea to say it. Maybe he even said something a little bit different, and Mar Bar Rav Ashi, heard a different message in his words. But Mar Bar Rav Ashi is a person who lives in emunah b'tachon. He lives in faith and trust in God. Meaning, everywhere he goes, everything he does, everything he sees God's hand in it. So even the words of an imbecile, if it's speaking to him and telling him something relevant about his own life, he's going to take that as a communication from heaven because he's constantly looking for God's hand and thereby God's word in every event, in every circumstance, in every person, in every word that he overhears. He is listening for God's communication. And because he lives that way, he gets it. He receives that communication, right? He came to this town with some confidence. Now, there really was some level of prophecy there. God was sending him a sign because he didn't know that position had just opened up. He heard that from the imbecile, right? And so he did receive some kind of a communication. And when he came, because he was always looking for God's hand in the matter, and God told him, so to speak, what would happen there, he had a certain degree of confidence. and he held himself, he carried himself like a guy who should be the Rosh Yeshiva, and he became the Rosh Yeshiva. It's a nice lesson. Look for God's hand in everything around you, and you'll find it. And in what way was prophecy given to children? It was like this incident involving the daughter of Rav Chisda, who when she was a child, sitting on her father's lap while he sat and learned. And Rava and Rami Bar Chama were sitting before him, and Rav Chisda jokingly said to his daughter, "Which of them do you want as a husband?" And she said, "I want both of them." And Rava said, "And I will be last." And this is what happened. Now, there's nothing inappropriate happening here, okay? This is a guy, whose daughter is playing on his lap while he's having a conversation with his fellow sages. They're all relatively young. And he said, which of these guys would you want to marry, right? Meaning when you grow up, and she says, oh, I like both of them, Now, Rava says maybe there is some, sign being said here. So he quickly said, I'll be last. She's going to marry both of us. It's not because she's going to divorce one and then marry the other, right? It's because one of us is going to leave her a widow and then the other one will come second. So I'll be last, right? And that's what ended up happening. That is what ended up happening. When she became an adult, one of them was still single, or maybe he had lost his first wife, who knows, ends up marrying the daughter of his fellow sage. And then that guy ends up dying, and she marries, the second guy who thought to say, I'll be last. Having already cited one statement of Rabbi Avdimi from Haifa, the Gemara cites another statement in his name. Rabbi Avdimi from Haifa says, before a person eats and drinks, he has two hearts, meaning his heart is unsettled because he is distracted by hunger. Everybody's got a hangry heart. The phrase hangry, right? When you're so hungry, you're angry. So until you've eaten, you can't focus on whatever you need to focus on. So, don't try to make difficult decisions on an empty stomach. But after a person eats and drinks, he has only one heart. As it is stated, a hollow man is two-hearted, Job 11:12. And how is it indicated that nevuv, hollow, means hungry? As it is written concerning the altar nevuv luchot in Exodus 27:8, which we translate into Aramaic as hollow with planks, meaning that a hollow person, i.e. one who has not yet eaten, has two hearts. He's not focused. Things haven't come into focus for him. And the Gemara continues discussing the meaning of this word nevuv, that we're translating as hollow, or even that your stomach is hollow, meaning you're hungry. So Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, says, with regard to one who is accustomed to wine, although his heart, i.e. his mind, is closed like a virgin, wine opens it. As it is stated, new wine opens, Yenovev, the virgins. The word Yenovev is used here, that's from Zechariah 9:17, and this word Yenovev is used here in the sense of clearing out a space. Even if one's heart and mind are closed, wine will open them to understanding, right? That's how we see. There's a bunch of cases, right, where the sages are kind of like cracking their heads over something they can't figure out the answer to a problem. They have a little wine and they shift the perspective, and then an answer comes. Is this to say that if you want to be wise, just drink a lot of wine and you'll suddenly be brilliant? Obviously not. This will only have an effect if you really, broke your head over the problem for a long time, and you couldn't quite come to the answer, but you've already invested long hours, right, in big brain cogitation, trying to come up with the answer. Then take a break, sleep on it, maybe have a glass of wine, and then maybe things will fall into place. Now, let's go back to our Mishna and the discussion of the division of property. The Gemara resumes its discussion of the division of property. Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, says, it is obvious that if a person inherits a portion of his father's estate because he is the firstborn, and he also inherits a portion of that estate as an ordinary son, right? In other words, let's say a man has 4 sons. Okay, so they're going to divide the estate into 5 parts. 4 sons, the estate gets divided into 5 parts. Why? Because each son gets an equal share. That's the 4 of the parts. And the firstborn gets a double share. That's why they need 5 parts, because the firstborn gets 2 of them. Now, if you divide it into 5 parts, 5 equal parts, okay, the firstborn is entitled to 2 of them. The question is the firstborn entitled to have those 2 parts next to each other? It's very convenient for him to have the 2 parts that he inherits be contiguous, right? For the same reason that if you're selling your property, assuming that, whatever the market price is of your property, you have to give an offer of first refusal, like give your neighbor a chance to buy it, because it's very handy for your neighbor to have 2 plots of land side by side, much handier than if they were far apart in 2 different parts of town. And refusing to give your neighbor that first chance to buy it is considered acting like the inhabitants of Sodom, right? Being needlessly, for no unnecessarily, what's the word I'm looking for? Nasty, right? You're just being nasty, right? You're refusing to sell just because it won't hurt you to sell it to him. It will help him. And if you refuse to do it, you're just being unnecessarily nasty to your neighbor. So does the same rule apply when there's an inheritance and the firstborn is going to get 2 of the portions and he'd like them to be contiguous? Well, we say the same thing. So the firstborn inherits both his firstborn portion and his portion as an ordinary son, like the rest of his brothers. And so he is given the 2 portions along one boundary so that they are adjacent to one another and form a single property. And so he is given that. So now the Gemara asks, what is the law with regard to a yavam? A man whose brother died, leaving a widow and no children. And now the surviving brother is obligated by Torah law to marry his deceased brother's widow or grant her chalitza, right? Release her from that marriage by going through the ceremony of chalitza. Now, if he marries his brother's widow, the law dictates that he receives his brother's portion of their father's estate in addition to his own. In that case, does he have the right to receive the 2 portions along one boundary, meaning contiguous? So Abaye said, this case is equal to that case. The firstborn gets 2 portions next to each other, and the yavam gets 2 portions right next to each other. And what is the reason for this? The merciful one calls the yavam firstborn. We saw that in Tractate Yevamos 24a. And therefore he is treated like a firstborn in this regard, and in other regards as well. And he receives the 2 portions of his father's estate as a single parcel of land. But Rava said, the verse states, and it shall be the firstborn. It shall be, the firstborn, from Deuteronomy 25:6. Now with regard to his being, i.e. his inheritance itself, he is like a firstborn. But as for the distribution of the estate, he is not like a firstborn, and the brothers are not obligated to give him 2 adjacent portions. It is reported that a certain person bought land along the boundary of his father's property. Right? So while his father was alive, he bought a neighboring parcel of land. Then his father dies, and now the land is going to be divvied up among the sons. So the son who has his own land already, neighboring, right, adjacent to his father's land, the part of his father's land that he's going to receive, he wants it to be adjacent to his own land that's on the other side of the border of his father's land, right? That's what he would like. So does he have a right to demand that of his co-inheritors, i.e. his brothers? Can he demand that? So it's reported that a certain person bought land along the boundary of his father's property. After some time, the father died. When they came to divide the estate, this person said to his brothers, give me my portion of the estate along my boundary. Rabbah said, in a case such as this, the court compels people to refrain from the conduct characteristic of Sodom, and the court forces a person to waive his legal rights in order to prevent him from acting in a manner characteristic of the wicked city of Sodom. Since it makes no difference to the brothers which portion they receive, why would it make no difference? Since the parcels of land must be of equal value. Whereas it matters to this brother that the area he receives should be adjacent to the land he already owns, the court forces the other brothers to give this brother his portion along his boundary. Rav Yosef says no. He objects and says this is not a case involving conduct characteristic of Sodom, since the brothers can explain their refusal to grant the request. The brothers can say to him, we assess this field that you want for yourself as particularly valuable, like the property of the house of Bar Mariam. The brothers can claim that the portion he wants is more desirable than the others, and for that reason they do not want to give it to him. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Yosef, and the brothers can refuse the request. Now it's interesting because when they divvy up the inheritance, right, the land that used to belong to the father, they have to divide it into equal portions, meaning not equal in area, but equal in value, right? Because you could say there's 30 acres, give each son 10 acres, but one of the 10-acre plots has water, and the other two don't. Obviously, these three parcels are not worth the same, right? They're not equal value, and that would not be a fair division of the inheritance. So since they have to have equal value, how can you say that one of the plots is more desirable than the others? Answer, yeah, that could happen, right? You could have them assessed by some kind of expert in land in this area, and they are equal in value, and nevertheless, one of them is maybe a little bit closer to town, one of them is a little bit closer to something, so there is a reason why one is better than the others. And if the best one happens to be the one that's adjacent to this land that the guy bought on the other side of the boundary, he can't just demand that it comes to him because it's adjacent to his other land that he purchased. If it happens to be the most desirable plot, he doesn't automatically get it. And that's a valid argument, and the law is, according to Rav Yosef, if a father leaves his sons 2 parcels of land next to 2 water channels, and one brother requests the field that is next to a field that he already owns. So Rabbah says in a case such as this, the court compels people to refrain from the conduct characteristic of Sodom and allows that brother to receive the field adjoining his own. Rav Yosef says no, saying that if the other brother protests and wants that parcel of land, it is not a case involving conduct characteristic of Sodom because he may have a valid reason for objecting. Sometimes this water channel continues running well, while this second one does not continue running well, and therefore the second brother wants to receive the land that adjoins a water channel on both sides. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Yosef. Again, they're not equal. If there's any reason that one plot might be better than the other, just the fact that it's bordering onto his other plot is not reason enough to give it to this one brother. And finally, if a father leaves his 2 sons 2 parcels of land next to one channel of water, and one of the brothers already owns a field next to one of those parcels of land, Rav Yosef said, in a case such as this, the court compels people to refrain from the conduct characteristic of Sodom. This time Rav Yosef said, okay, now the plots are equal. There's 2 plots of land, they're the same size, same value, they're both bordering on the same channel of water. One of the brothers would like to get the plot that borders his other land that is, adjacent to one of these plots, so he can have it. But now Abaye objects to Rav Yosef, his teacher. Abaye objects, saying that this is not a case involving conduct characteristic of Sodom because the brother without his own plot of land can say to his brother, I want the number of sharecroppers to increase. If my field is in the middle and you have fields on either side, right, so you don't get contiguous fields, but your fields surround my field, that actually is an advantage to me. Why? Because there's people working on both sides of my field, and that makes my field more secure from robbers. Right? I want the number of sharecroppers to increase. If my field is in the middle and you have fields on either side, you will need more sharecroppers to work them, and my field will enjoy greater security. And the law is not in accordance with Abaye. It is in accordance with his teacher Rav Yosef because the increase of sharecroppers, this is considered as nothing. And this is therefore not a valid reason for objecting. If there's a water channel on one side of the field and a river on the other side, the field is divided diagonally between the 2 brothers so that they each receive land adjoining both the river and the water channel. Now we're at the top of page 13a, and that is where we'll continue tomorrow, Monday, God willing, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And sorry I didn't give you the warning to get your comments and questions in now. But hopefully there'll be some there already that I can start with. L'chaim. Sharon, I remember reading how if a tree is growing over a grave and its branches extend over a sidewalk, the tuma extends to all areas under the tree, including the sidewalk. In other words, this is corpse tuma, the tuma of a tent. Right? In other words, if you're under a ceiling, under a roof with a corpse, you don't have to touch the corpse or be located over the corpse in order to become tameh with corpse tuma. It's enough that you shared a roof. Now, can a roof be a canopy of branches? I don't remember this teaching offhand, but Sharon is telling us yes. Can that roof link a grave, which is presumably in some kind of private domain, to a sidewalk, which is a public thoroughfare, under that same canopy? Sharon is saying yes. So therefore, a Kohen, right, a priest, cannot therefore walk on that sidewalk even if it is outside of the cemetery. Since the shade of a tree has no portal, is there no remediation for this situation? That is a deep question, Sharon. And I do not know the answer offhand. I do not know that body of law just offhand well enough to answer. But I wonder, when you say there's no portal, we were talking before about a building, right, that has no entranceway. When we just say that a roof that has no opening in it, but it's open on all sides, right? So are we going to say that has no portal? I'm not sure that would satisfy that concept of no portal, but I'm not sure. If wouldn't it be expected that different sages could reach the same understanding independently because it is drawn from Torah and is a correct, true understanding? Definitely. I think that they were talking about is a little bit hyperbolic, right? And in a sense, not hyperbolic, because it's not that the sages are saying we are a special class and everyone should defer to us. It's that the sages were saying in our learning, right, in our dedicated learning, we spend decades studying 12, 15, 18 hours a day. I mean, they're so dedicated to that learning that no one is in a better position than they to be in awe of the sages who are the greatest sages, right? So no one understands better than a sage how awesome the greatest sages are. And what they're saying is, I've toiled in Torah study for decades, doing nothing else. I mean, so immersed in it. And what that guy was able to see in the text, I could never see, right? So yeah, that guy's just a colossal genius. But maybe he also is such a tzaddik, such a righteous person, such a holy person, that he merited to have an insight that I did not merit to have. And I think that's the sense in which they're ascribing prophecy, to the greatest sages. Sharon says, if the Yavam is in fact the firstborn, does he get 3 parcels of land? Great question, right? So she's saying that so a firstborn inherits a double portion, and then if his, let's say he's got 2 brothers, and one of them dies, leaving a widow and no sons. So if the firstborn marries the widow of that younger brother, does he end up getting the double portion as the firstborn and the additional portion for taking over, his brother's land when he marries the widow, and he's going to sustain the widow and the child, right, of the dead brother, because that first child that he has with the widow is going to be the heir of that other brother, and he's sort of tending this piece of land for that son of the dead brother. So I think the answer is absolutely he would get 3 portions in that situation. That is my understanding. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific on Monday.